This is a lecture for the course Economics 3210, Economics of the Public Sector. The topic for this lecture is efficiency and the economic role of government. Okay, so let's talk about efficiency and the economic role of government. The standard normative economics approach to government is to say that the role of government is to achieve an efficient allocation of resources. The generic idea of efficiency is getting the most out of what you've got, and the idea of efficiency in economics will fit with this. But it also turns out that the economic concept of efficiency is a very specific concept. It's called Pareto optimality. Okay, so what does Pareto optimality mean? Well, here's a precise definition. An allocation of resources is Pareto optimal if it is impossible to change the allocation in a way that would make at least one person better off without the same time making another person worse off. So look at this carefully, give a lot of thought to it. One thing to consider now is what is the meaning of the word allocation. An allocation is a list. It's like a list telling the goods and services that each person has. And notice that in this definition, a key value judgment that economists make is economists judge an efficient allocation of resources based on the well-being of people in the community themselves. It's not based upon how I think about what a good or efficient allocation is, or what someone else thinks. Now, in order to understand how the definition of Pareto optimality represents an efficient allocation of resources, we need the concept of a Pareto improvement. Here's a definition of a Pareto improvement. A Pareto improvement exists if it is possible to change the allocation and make at least one person better off without, at the same time, making another person worse off. Now, if you think about this, the possibility of making a Pareto improvement away from the existing allocation means it is possible to get more out of what we've got. That is, if it is possible to change the allocation and make at least one person better off without harming another person at the same time, it's possible to get more well-being for people in the community than we have in the status quo. So if we have a Pareto optimal allocation, this means that no Pareto improvements are possible. It is not possible to get more well-being in the community out of what we've got. And this would have to be an efficient allocation of resources. Now, when economists talk about evaluating whether someone is better off or worse off, we make what I like to call the individualistic ethic. So there are several value judgments in order to decide if a person is better off or worse off from the point of view of an economist. The first is that we take each individual's subjective preferences as given. We don't try to evaluate those preferences. We don't say these are good preferences, or those are better preferences, or those are bad preferences. We let each individual, in our conceptual view, we let each individual decide for himself or herself whether a change in allocation makes them better off or worse off. The second aspect of the individualistic ethic is that we treat all individuals the same or equally. Equally is not the best word, but I want you to understand that we don't look at say the president's preferences and decide that his or her preferences are more important than my preferences or your preferences. So I wonder, you need to think about this idea of Pareto optimality, and since this is normative and we make value judgments, I want you to consider, would you dispute these value judgments. Now, in actual politics, many people would apparently dispute these value judgments. For example, many people in politics, and talking about politics and government, might say something like, government should use a progressive income tax to gain social justice. In other words, there would be value judgments that the role of government is to gain social justice and not value judgments associated with gaining efficiency. You might also hear in politics someone say, people should want to protect nature as it is. And this would be disputing the value judgment, I think, that we take individuals' preferences as given. Another possibility that you might hear is, most scientists agree that man-made global warming is happening and that government must stop it. And this would be a different kind of value judgment than we make in economics because, again, it disputes the value judgment that we should take individual preferences as given. Now, because all of this is normative, or that these value judgments we use to talk about the economic role of government, since they're value judgments, I can't tell you what value judgments to accept. It's your decision. As far as I'm concerned, though, in this class, your task is to know and to understand the value judgments that we make in normative economics. The definition of efficiency, or a Pareto optimal allocation of resources, when you look at it, it may seem kind of complex. So you might wonder, is a Pareto optimal allocation of resources even possible? After all, it may seem impossible to find any allocative change from the status quo that is actually a Pareto improvement, where no one would complain, for example. On the other hand, as economists, we understand that any exchange is a voluntary two-person social interaction. Both parties to the exchange are better off. And so the fact is, every exchange that happens in the economy involves a Pareto improvement. So actual Pareto improvements abound in the real world. Well, look, there really are no economic ideas on this slide. It's just a picture that I like. Well, what then is the economic role of government? The economic role of government is to achieve a Pareto optimal allocation of resources. If it turns out that the voluntary market process attains a Pareto optimal allocation, then the role of government is to leave the market process alone. On the other hand, if the voluntary market process fails to attain a Pareto optimal allocation of resources, or if really we think it's likely to fail to achieve a Pareto optimal allocation, then the role of government is to correct what is known as a market failure. And that's what a market failure is. Leave the market alone. If it doesn't attain efficiency, there's a market failure. Conceptually, there are three classic types of market failure: externality, public good, and monopoly. I want to introduce the sort of general ideas of these three sources of market failure. Let's start with externality. An externality is a benefit or cost outside of the market exchange. Makes someone better off or worse off. And it's a better off and worse off for a third party, not the two participants in the exchange, the buyer or the seller. A classic negative or harmful externality is air pollution. There are also positive or beneficial externalities we call positive externalities. Now, the basic idea of a public good, which is a source of market failure, is a good whose consumption is both non-rival and non-excludable. A simple idea of a public good is a good that people share in consumption. I'm not sure there are very many public goods, but if there are public goods, actual public goods, it's a source of market failure. And a classic sort of public good is thought to be national defense. The last source of market failure we'll talk about is a monopoly. Here's a picture of a monopoly. Monopoly is a single seller. There are lots of buyers, but only one seller. Monopoly is inefficient because the monopoly's choice of output is such that price is greater than marginal cost. If there's a monopoly, this means from the point of view of economic efficiency that there's too little output. Typically, monopoly source of market failure is not discussed in a public finance course. It would certainly be discussed in intermediate microeconomics, perhaps also discussed in a course on industrial organization.